Like I can't read it anymore because of the.
Right. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm glad that you're here. Thank you, Ed Hirsch and our Adult Education Committee for helping organize today's program. Welcome. Some more people are joining us online, and you're more than welcome. You can turn your cameras on or off as well so we can all see you and see each other here in the Finger Boardroom. And really special thanks to Bennett Greenspan for being with us this morning. We're going to continue in this space through the presentation, and then afterwards, in about an hour or so, we'll head to the Choctaw Library. Those of us in the room, we have a beautiful reception and a brunch set up for us with bagels and lox for us in the Choctaw Library for us to enjoy following the program. But just a little bit of information about Mr. Greenspan. Entrepreneur and lifelong genealogy enthusiast. I know we have other genealogy enthusiasts in the room, so this is a really wonderful, you're among friends here. Bennett Greenspan founded Family Tree DNA in 2000. Family Tree DNA was the first company in the world to develop DNA testing for ancestry and genealogical purposes into a commercial business. The Y chromosome test, the company's original product, started the direct-to-consumer genetics testing revolution. Mr. Greenspan's business and entrepreneur experience spans photo imaging, industrialized photography, and commercial real estate. In a prior career, he oversaw, I know a lot about prior careers, he oversaw the conversion of a company, Salesforce, from analog to digital data capture. Born in Omaha, Nebraska, he graduated high school in Nebraska in 1970 and graduated from the University of Texas with honors in the government department in 1974. Mr. Greenspan is married with 2 children, and we are very grateful and very excited to hear what he has to say. Thank you. Wonderful. Great. And I'm going to go ahead and share the screen whenever you're comfortable. Okay, we're going to share the screen so everybody can see and follow along.
See what that says. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hit the lights on the way out? This way I can't see if anyone falls asleep.
That's right.
You see now all the guests on Zoom are in very small boxes.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Is that okay?
I might not be there. I might do them at other times so that I can more easily.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
Is that Steve?
It doesn't even look like it's bright enough to be able to.
Well, I don't know that the TV screen will work with an infrared,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Very good.
but you can come up and you can
Just,
switch it.
okay.
Or you can use the screen on the computer, the mouse on the computer pointer, and do it that way.
thank you.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ed, for inviting me. I know we talked about this for many months. This is the first time I've made this presentation since COVID began. The last time I made this presentation was at the APAC Policy Conference in March of 2020. And we came home that week to get ready for lockdown. So this is kind of unlockdown. And so it's my pleasure to be speaking to you, but I will tell you, other than a lot of reviewing yesterday, I haven't looked at this data in over 2.5 years. So you're likely to see a slightly less scripted version of myself. And if you find that I have momentary gaps as I go between slide and slide, you'll just have to excuse me on that. I have been a genealogist since I was a boy. My grandmother died 10 days after my 13th birthday and about 3 weeks before my bar mitzvah. And that day we went to the cemetery and for the burial, and after the burial, my father took my hand and my mother took my brother's hand, and we went in the cemetery to visit relatives. Now, I thought I was growing up in Omaha with no relatives because my father had 2 siblings, didn't live in Omaha. My mother did have a couple of siblings in Omaha, but their children had left. I had no first cousins living in the city. I had no second cousins living in the city. And I thought I had no relatives until we went to the cemetery. And I found that we had lots of relatives all lined up, one next to the other, just waiting for someone to come and scribe the information down and add it to a genealogical chart. And so that night, when people came to my parents' house for the Shiva call, I was the little kid who was walking around with a pen and paper asking the old relatives, especially those with accents, if they would tell me about their parents, their grandparents, their siblings, their great aunts and uncles. And so on that day, I drew my first genealogical tree. So here's an example of that genealogical tree. And you can see that there wasn't much reverence to it. If we wanted to figure out someone's birth, someone just wrote down 1896, knew that they died when they were 39, figured out that they were born in 1857, and it got written. And if there were mistakes, we just crossed them out. But we did all of that work that day. And ultimately, what we're going to talk about today, among other things, is the NITS line. That would be my mother's father's line. And that's important because ultimately I decided to start studying that line. And before I get you into that, I want to show you what an enthusiastic 13-year-old looks like just before his bar mitzvah. Thanks to yearbooks.com, this can be shown or shared with anyone, much to my chagrin. And so I decided I would just, take the bull by the horns and present the picture. Now, what happened to me was that in 1996, I sold my photographic supply company. And I worked for the wonderful people that bought the company for the next 19 months, which I refer to as the longest 19 months of my life. One day, my wife came home and she said, Bennett, since you're home and home all the time, would you mind getting the groceries out of the car? And I said, no problem, dear. And I did so. And I put them on the counter. And I then took the items out of the bags and put those on the counter, put the bags away and said, dear, would you like me to put these in the cupboard? And she said, sure. And then I opened up the cupboard. I opened up my wife's domain and I found a Hilaria. I found the whole peeled tomatoes on one shelf, the spaghetti sauce on another shelf, the spaghetti on yet another shelf. And I said, dear, would you like me to reorganize your cupboard? And she looked at me, and ladies, you got this already. Some of us guys don't. And she looked at me and she said, you need to learn how to play golf. Or you need to pick up your genealogy again, but you need to get out of my kitchen. And so tail between legs, I left and I went and picked up my genealogy and I started working on the NITS line, N-I-T-Z, the one that I had pointed out earlier. And I took about 6 weeks and I had found all of my deceased grandmother's siblings, the 5 of them. They weren't alive, but I found their children or their children's children. And I made this nice genealogical chart. And then I mailed that genealogical chart to the cousins, some of whom might have cared and some of whom didn't care at all. Just proves it was a normal family. And so I sent it out to them and I said, well, I'm done. I finished that line. And then I entered the name NITS into a database at a website called Jewish Gen. And I entered it into something called the Family Finder. And I found a match to the surname NITS. I found a young lady named Maria de Los Angeles Nitz, living in Buenos Aires. And I wrote to her. She wrote me back with very bad English, but much better than my Spanish. And she told me that she was busy and that she would get to the genealogy in a couple of weeks. So to encourage her, I sent her a copy of our genealogy. And about 5 minutes later, am I making that noise?
Yes.
Oh, my God. Okay. So about 5 minutes later, I receive an email from her and she says, tell me everything you can about Anna Nitz, my grandmother, because my grandmother's name was Anya Nitz. Wow. And my grandmother Nitz came from the same village in the Ukraine that these people came from. So when we dug into it, we found that they had 6 relatives, 6 children. 2 of the names were the same as 2 of the names of my grandmother and her 5 siblings. So we had Jewish naming conventions.
Someone's got their
Yeah,
sound
someone's not
down there.
muted.
I don't know how to turn that off, though.
So we had naming convention and we had village in common. And I felt that we were so close that we must have found family. They sent their ketubah, copy of their ketubah up here. I had it translated hoping that my relative Nitz had been a signer on that ketubah, because that would prove in my mind that we were related, but no such luck. And so I was a little bit down in my beer. I went out to walk the family dog in late August. Let me come up to this.
I don't think it's you that's making the noise. I think it's the
Yeah.
on Zoom that are not
So
muted.
folks on Zoom, if everyone could make sure that you muted your microphone, we're hearing some feedback from our end. Thank you. So it's 1999. I may have found relatives. I had previously read the first Y chromosome study that was conducted in 1997 on the Kohanim. I use this picture because here Leonard Nimoy is giving the symbol of the Kohanim, which had been rebranded as a Vulcan sign that said live long and prosper. And now the world knows the symbol of the Kohanim as live long and prosper rather than as something Jewish. But in his book, written over 20 years ago, Leonard Nimoy said he picked this symbol because he was mesmerized by the chanting of the Kohanim in his synagogue when he was a boy. Wow. So I went out and took a walk. And during the walk, I remembered this study and I remembered the Jefferson study of 1998. I came home that night and I got on the internet and I found that those two studies had been written by two teams. Only one person from the Kohanim study was an American and everyone on the Jefferson study was English. And so the next morning I got up and I called the Jewish co-author of the study, Dr. Michael Hammer, who was in Arizona. Now, Dr. Michael Hammer is a typical professor, doesn't really deal with the non-academic world unless he absolutely has to, like when he gets a flat tire or a speeding, ticket. But other than that, he's in that academic.
I think he was on What the Bleep Do We Know?
I'm sorry?
What the Bleep Do We Know, Michael Hammer?
Michael Hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was on What the Bleep Do We Know?
You
You don't know the movie?
No.
Oh.
Bleep is the word you can't say, yeah.
Okay, so I got Michael Hammer on the telephone and I asked him, will you do a DNA test for my cousin in California and for the possible cousin in Argentina? And he said, no, we only do that for academic purposes. And I said, well, will this work? And he said, of course, it'll show whether those nitzes are related or not. However, come on in, folks. However, the problem in this case was that I couldn't find anyone to offer this kind of commercial testing. And I said that to Hammer, where can I go to buy a DNA test? And he responded to me by saying, I don't think that anyone is offering a commercial DNA test like this anywhere in the world. And I was speechless. I'm a salesman. I choreograph my sales calls. I anticipate no, and I think, and I have historically thought of objections to get past the no. Well, in this case, when he told me he wouldn't do it and no one was doing it commercially in the world, I didn't know what to say. And so I just, and in that long, uncomfortable silence that took place on the telephone call, he blinked. He said, well, someone should start a company like this because I get phone calls from crazy genealogists like you all the time. At which point I rushed him off the phone. I told him I was going to write a business plan that weekend if I, as a lowly genealogist, had an opportunity to offer this as a service in the world. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to give you briefly a short primer on anthrogenetics. We're going to talk about historians' claims on the origin of the Jews. Who are the Jews on a genetic level?
Could you tell these people?
I don't know how to do that. Listen, if y'all can hear me, can y'all hear me on Zoom?
Traditional interpretation, the flood would have had to have been.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. If everyone on Zoom could please mute your microphone, that would be really helpful to all of us on this side. Thank you, folks.
Let's see who's not.
Okay.
No,
So-
they did. They all just did.
All right, let me just go on with this and we'll just try to get past the technical difficulties. So, and the last question is, can molecular biology possibly answer what had been an historically non-provable argument? So first, our primer on genetics. This is a picture of the cell. In the center of the cell in purple, you have the 23 chromosomes, and outside of the center or nucleus of the cell, you have what's called the mitochondria. Mitochondria is passed from every woman to all of her children, and it's the girl's job to pass that mitochondria on to the next generation. So my brother and I have the mitochondria from my mother, but because I have no sisters, my mother's mitochondria will not be passed down to the next generation. My children have the mitochondria of their mother. I have a daughter. If she has children, she would pass that mitochondria on. My son will not. My son, on the other hand, passes his Y chromosome, which goes from father to son and son to grandson, literally unaltered for generations. And so it's a good proxy for the male line. Let me show you what that actually looks like. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We have 22 pairs that are known as the autosomes. The autosomes are like two decks of cards, one red, one blue, and you're asked to shuffle it. And every time you successfully shuffle the deck, you have a child. That's why children look similar to each other or may favor their parents because they are comprised of those two decks of cards. But the reason that children don't look identical is because when we shuffle those cards, we don't shuffle them the second and the third time in exactly the same order as we shuffled the first time. And so that's kind of a simple way to think about autosomal DNA. Down in the lower right-hand corner, we also have a pair of sex chromosomes. There is the small demure Y chromosome, which makes men men. And by the way, doesn't seem that the Y chromosome passes anything else on to a man other than his maleness. Now, there are some studies that are not well published that say that the clicker gene is something that's conveyed from the Y chromosome and the Sunday morning sports gene. I don't know for sure. I'm just throwing that out there for you. So those are the chromosomes. Let's briefly recap DNA for genealogy and anthropology. The Y DNA helps you identify paternal, male cousins, and possibly your ancient migratory path. mtDNA, mitochondria, does the exact same thing from the mother's standpoint. So I can see if someone and I share a common female ancestor going back by doing an mtDNA test, and that will tell me if they and I share the same mtDNA, just like I can test other men, let's say, who have the name of Greenspan, to determine whether those Greenspans are related to me or whether it was just a lazy Eastern European tax collector that assigned the name Greenspan to these people in this village and these unrelated people in that village. Pictorially, and the autosomal DNA is what is used rather ubiquitously to show your ethnic percentages. We've all seen those commercials from Ancestry or 23andMe that say, hey, I thought I was Italian. Turns out I'm Polish. Let's go get a sausage. So that's the autosomal DNA. It can also help you determine relatives, but only back to about a third cousin, maybe a fourth cousin level. So to show you a picture of what this looks like, we have on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, you have a great-grandfather who passes his Y chromosome down to his son, who passes it to his son, who passes it to me. Whereas my great-grandmother passed her mitochondria to her daughter, who passed it to my mother, who would pass it to my sister if I had one, but I also have my mother's mitochondria. But everyone in the center here is not directly addressable with the Y or with mitochondria. It's only addressable if you use the autosomal or the recombinant DNA. And so this, because it's uniparental, okay, it's very, very precise, but it excludes 62 of your 64 great grandparents. And so in that respect, it's not terribly worthwhile if you're trying to cast a very broad net, but if you're trying to determine relatedness on your dad's side or mom's side, the Y or the mtDNA can really be a silver bullet. So on the Y chromosome side, we have what's called a phylogeny. A phylogeny or phylogenetic tree shows how evolution has taken place within a species. Y chromosome for mankind is somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years old. And this is the structure, the phylogeny of the Y chromosome of mankind. And each of these branches not only has geographical specificity, for example, branch N is typically found in Finland, and I is found in southeastern Europe, and J is typically found in the Levant, all the way from the Kurdistan region in the north to Oman and Yemen in the south. And that's because people tended to stay in the places that they were living and didn't move around a whole heck of a lot.
How do you know when it's a J?
If I could save all the questions until the end, it'll help the flow, but I'm happy to answer the questions. So this has been studied and written about for now at least 3 decades. Scientists have been pawing through this haplogroup data. So we know, for example, that A is found in southeastern Africa. B is a little bit more spread out in southern Africa. D is found typically in Japan. Interestingly, it's also found in the mountains of Tibet. E is found, one branch is found in North Africa among our cousins, the Arabs, and another branch of E is found south of the Sahara. G is found in the Caucasus, H is found in India, I is southeastern Europe, J is the quintessential Y chromosome of Semites, L is found, I cannot remember, I'm sorry, M is found in Micronesia, N, as I mentioned, in Finland, O is found in China, Q is found in Central Asia, R is very spread out all the way from northern India all the way to Ireland. That R group is actually associated with the Middle Age invaders who came out of the steppe of Russia probably 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, but they came with metal, which means that they just terrorized the hunter-gatherers and the Neolithic farmers that had already arrived. And haplogroup T, S is found in Micronesia. T is found at very small frequencies in the Middle East. Okay, now we're going to get a little controversial here, if you can do that so early in the morning. We're going to talk about historical claims without genetics. What I'm saying is that the people who pontificated these theories did so before we had genetics, which means that even if they're wrong, we have to give them kind of a pass because they didn't have what I'm referring to as a truth set to be able to differentiate theory from fact. Has anyone here ever read the book or heard the book The 13th Tribe
Yeah, I've heard.
by Arthur Koestler.
Yeah.
So Arthur Koestler was born in Europe of Jewish parents, never saw himself as a Jewish person. He saw himself as of Jewish ancestry. Joined the Communist Party, but he was tired of that by 1938. He had grown tired of Stalin and moved to England, where he lived for the rest of his life. And Arthur Koestler had a theory. The theory was that Eastern European Jews are not descended from the Judeans of antiquity, but rather they were converts to Judaism from a group of people called the Khazars, who were an 8th century Turkic people who lived north of the Black Sea, from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea and north all the way to Kiev. And so he further claimed that the Khazars had somehow migrated after their empire was destroyed by the Russians in the 1000s. They had somehow migrated to Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, just those places that our ancestors happened to come from. However, there was kind of a silver lining in what Koestler was saying, because he said, if what I'm saying can be proven, anti-Semitism can end, as Jews will have been proven not to be Semites. And so that was his theory. Now, I'm going to show you another book. It comes from a guy named Tex Marr. I don't know if
I know him.
you've heard that name.
Yeah.
Okay. So Tex Marr is no longer with us.
Oh, yeah.
He succumbed to something in 2009, but he had penned a book called DNA Science and the Jewish Bloodline. And I've always said that when an anti-Semite or a Nazi quotes you, you probably are saying the wrong thing. So that's where Iran El Hayek, a Sephardic / Mizrahi professor of plant genetics originally, gets involved. Iran, I knew Iran from working at the National Geographic Society. No matter how much data we showed him, he wasn't getting off the idea that the Ashkenazi Jews, in other words, the Jews in Israel, who at that time were the majority, both numerically and economically, and he really had an issue, I believe, with Ashkenazi Jews. And he said, and quoted by Tex, he said, there are no blood or family connections among the Jews. The various groups of Jews in the world today do not share a common genetic origin. Their genome is largely Khazar. Whatever Israelite blood the Khazar Jews have is minuscule. And the problem with this is that it leads to what I refer to as BDDS, which stand for boycott, divest, delegitimize, and sanction a country or a people. And that's what these guys are trying to do to us. And so I saw this, I was making this slide up, and I said, I need to find a slide that encapsulates what I just said. And I think I did a pretty good job here and found it. When you start delegitimizing the first and second Aliyah to Israel, and you start saying that the Jews of Europe are not Jews from antiquity, but are usurpers to the land, it's easy to connect an intellectual thread that says everything about Israel is illegal. And now I have one more for you. Has anyone here heard of Professor Shlomo Sand?
Yes, I heard it. I heard him.
So Professor Sand is internationally well known in bad circles for his books, The Invention of the Jewish People and The Invention of the Land of Israel. He got his PhD in Marxism. He got his MA in French history. He left Israel and spent many years in Paris, only coming back about 20 years ago to Israel because he said the coffee scene in Tel Aviv is remarkable and that he just couldn't be away any longer. So I would ask you, are his statements malicious or are they just from an uninformed historian? This is what I found on his website in 2009, and I'll read it for you. It says, there is no racial or ethnic basis for being Jewish any more than there is for being Christian or Muslim. The great majority of those who today consider themselves Jews are descendants from converts in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and North Africa, not from ancient Hebrews mythically expelled from the Holy Land by the Romans, and hence are in no sense ethnic Semites of Near Eastern origin or ethnic anything else. And there is so much in that statement to unpack that rather than too much commentary, I'm just going to start doing so. Let's take that first point. There's no racial or ethnic basis for being Jewish any more than there is for being Christian or Muslim. Sand seems to reject the idea of any historical connection and therefore genetic overlap between Jews from different countries and different backgrounds. His arguments claim the Jews who are Sephardic and the Jews who are Ashkenazi share nothing but a false belief that there must be a genetic link between those historically separated groups. That would seem to extend to groups around the world who claim to have been Jewish in the past as well. Let's look at a few real world examples. The first example is a fellow named Javier Caldes. Y'all familiar with the island of Mallorca?
Yes.
Or have you heard of the word Chihueta?
No.
Okay, the Chihuetas are a group of people who today number about 18,000 people in Mallorca who were forcibly converted to Catholicism shortly after the 1391 riots in Spain, and by 1435, it was an effete complete. They had all been converted. Javier wanted to reach out and see his Jewishness. He turned to DNA testing to confirm his community's history. And here are a couple of emails that I had with Javier in 2013 and 2014. He wrote, unfortunately, since the Inquisition, it was too dangerous to be a Jew in Mallorca, and no one would talk about the subject. The conversions were so enforced and for so many years that Chihuetas had to show that they were very religious in the Catholic faith, and even though they were not accepted in that society until this day. So all I've learned from Judaism is what I've studied on my own. I see all this heritage as a responsibility for me to do something to go back to my roots. I'm not married yet, and really, it would be great to have a Jewish wife. That way, Judaism would be important again in my family, and my kids would be Jewish, all back to the way it was. And so I wrote him about a year later and said, have you done genealogy in your family? And he said, yes. I even have a family tree done to the 1500s. And all ancestors on my mother's side have combinations of the 15 surnames that all Chihuetas have. As you know, there was a lot of marriage within, and they did not marry with other people with non-Jewish background. My grandmother, a Chihueta from both sides, mother and father, was the first to marry a non-Chihueta, and that was like a Shanda in Spanish. Since the forcible conversions of the 1400s, if you see the matches in her DNA, it looks like a shul directory. Now, one interesting thing here, the anecdote is that the Chihuetas used to stand in the doorposts, under the doorposts of their house, gnawing on pork ribs to prove to their Catholic neighbors that they were just as Catholic even though they were discriminated against and the Catholics wouldn't marry them. And so they remained intact, almost a complete Jewish community following Catholicism for 550 years. Now, when I take a look at that and I look at Javier's DNA, I find in the area circled in red that they have an mtDNA signature, which is not European, it's from the Middle East. Not only is it from the Middle East, every other person on that list, including a third cousin of mine once removed, is Jewish. Now, this was done in 2013, 2014, before we started doing a lot of outreach into the Sephardic community. Interestingly, Javier's mitochondria, while Middle Eastern, matches lots of Ashkenazi Jews. So in this case, there's a clear overlap between someone who said I was Sephardic and converted to Catholicism versus someone who's always said we're Ashkenazi Jews. Kind of interesting. Let's take the case of Guillermo Carrasco. This is on his Y side. Guillermo did a DNA test and called because he said that he found his results interesting. So interesting that not only do his matches show he has a lot of matches in Eastern Europe and has some in the New World, but he asked me, he didn't understand what was this word Ashkenazi, because he had all these matches to people who claimed that their heritage was Ashkenazi, but he was from Spain. And so here I've put a red line underneath all of the names here that are Ashkenazi. And if it doesn't have an underline underneath it, those people are not Ashkenazi, but they are Hispanic Catholics like Echevarria, Romero, Tenorio, Chavez, Tenorio again. But what really surprised me is when I found the name Bennett Greenspan on his match list.
Oh,
And I see myself as an Ashkenazi Jew, but between 1,000 and 1,500 years ago, he and I shared a common male ancestor, and in all likelihood, we shared that common male ancestor in Spain. And so just because I go to an Ashkenazi synagogue with a bima in the front, not in the center, doesn't mean that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, my ancestors didn't decide to quit Spain and to move to Eastern Europe and to acculturate among Ashkenazi Jews, although I think it's pretty clear that both Guillermo and I share a Spanish and Sephardic background.
Wow.
So let me take you one step further here. Professor Sands also said, and the great majority of those who consider themselves Jews are descended from converts in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. Well, now it's time to really look back at the DNA and try to answer the question, who are male Jews on a genetic level? And can molecular biology now answer a previously non-provable argument? So it's time to go back to that phylogenetic tree. What I've done here is I've annotated on the right the area of the world that those branches, for example, North Africa E and Caucasus G, okay, those branches happen to be branches where Jewish men are found. Okay, both they're found in when we test Ashkenazi men. So you have North Africa, Caucasus, Southeastern Europe, the Fertile Crescent, Central Asia, Turkey, and all the way into Eastern Europe and Lebanon and the Fertile Crescent.
Primarily men.
This is 100% men.
This is because they were merchants or something?
This is 100% men because we're looking at the Y chromosome. And how the Jews spread, we don't exactly know. We have some historical help. For example, we know that there were Jews in North Africa from the time of Carthage. And I've been to Morocco where I've seen, Hebrew writing, which came from the last 15 or 1800 years. So the interesting thing about this is that every man on the planet can be placed somewhere on this tree, on one of these branches. And just because you're an E or an I or a J doesn't mean you're Jewish. But what we're saying is that some men who are E and I and J are Jewish. The question is, what are the rest of the men who are E and I and J? And what kind of overlap is there between various Jewish groups? And can we determine the origin of Jews on our father's side by looking at these various groups? So there is no known large-scale reports of conversion of non-Jews into Sephardic Jewry, the way Kostler is claiming there was such a large-scale conversion of Khazars into Judaism. So from that, I think that we can accept that Sephardic Jews might be a good proxy for what Jews look like. So let's look at Sephardic Jews. And instead of just thinking about the branches that I talked about, let's put some numbers to them. 48% of Sephardic Jews are from that group in the Middle East called J. 48%. 13% are from a North African group. 16% are from that group of the Caucasus. And then you have some big players down here. You have the Central Asian group at 2%. You have the Southeastern Europe group at 1%. And you have 3% T, which is this group that's found scattered in the Middle East and in particular in Lebanon. So if this is Sephardic Jews, either one of two things is going to happen. I'm going to show you the Ashkenazi Jews, and they're going to be different enough that you can see the conversion of the Khazars as they infuse themselves into our gene pool, or it's not going to be that way. It's one or the other. Here, I'm sorry. Oh, R is a group that's found from Syria, Turkey, and also found in northern India. And as it moves into Europe, R1A becomes dominant. And once you kind of cross the old East German, West German border, the population kind of changes to another R group called R1B. And that group is found dominant in Spain, in Portugal, in France, as I said, Western Germany, the Benelux countries, England, Ireland, and Scotland. So you find this R ubiquitously spread out through Europe. Now here's our Ashkenazi. Let me take you back to that again. Here's the Ashkenazi Jews. Here's the Sephardic Jews. Then I reached out to Dr. Hammer, who I've worked with for 15 years, and I said, look, can you send me the non-Jews from all the Middle Eastern countries? So if they're Turkish Jews or they're Iraqi Jews, we want to exclude them. We just want to look at what the non-Jews from the Middle East look like, because we, in theory, should be a subset of them unless we've had this massive infusion into our gene pool. So this is the Muslim population of the Middle East. So just to show you, there they are. And you can look for yourself. You can see that they're about 44% Middle Eastern, Ashkenazi are 41, Sephardic are 48. They're all in the 40s, for God's sakes. Now, let me show you what the Ukraine looks like.
This is a Ukraine non-Jew.
This is Ukraine non-Jews.
Wow.
Okay? So you have 8% instead of 40. Instead of a couple percent, you have 36% of this I group. You have a much enlarged R group to the exclusion of G from the Caucasus and the North African branch. And let's see.
Russians are right. They are genetically different.
They're radically genetically different. They're radically genetically different from these groups. So that I thought that was pretty interesting. And in all fairness to the erudite professors who have been pontificating about this, they didn't have the DNA or they didn't take the time to look at the DNA. And so I would ask you the question, who are we? Well, I will tell you this. There are Muslims who are from Arabia, so they're called Muslim Arabs. There are Christians from the Arab countries, Syria, 10 million Coptics in Egypt, okay? There are Christian Arabs. And I contend to you that based on what I've just shown you on the male inherited Y chromosome, that there are also Jewish Arabs. The sound of that statement sounds peculiar to the ring in our ears, doesn't mean it's not the truth, okay? And so now I have to ask you, is it time for the ultimate political question? I think it is. It is. Is Israel now ready, or should they now make an application to join the Arab League? I mean, for God's sakes, we are as Arab on our Y chromosome side as any Muhammad or any Mukhtar or any Mehmed that you'll find out there.
They're Semites.
They're Semites, we're Semites.
Yeah.
Get over it. And just in case, I want you to know that your speaker is ready. However, I contend you'll always be able to tell the Jewish Arabs because we're the ones wearing the Tommy Bahama shirts.
Oh, and I thought it was churches.
And Professor Sands went on and said, and not from ancient Hebrews, mythically expelled from the Holy Land by the Romans, and hence are in no sense Semites of Near Eastern origin or ethnic anything else. I mean, I understand he was on a roll and it was a diatribe, but that statement to me is so out of character with any truth that I understand that I have to wonder if it was a statement made out of ignorance or a statement made out of anger.
Which year roughly was this statement made?
He wrote this in 2009. I took this off his
Information.
Carved it in stone.
DNA was already out there, but there was another something. Who knows what this is?
There we go.
It's the Arch of Titus.
The Romans carved it in stone.
And when I took this picture of the Arch of Titus, there was an inscription. The inscription records the dedication of this arch, quote, by the Senate and the people of Rome to the emperor after his victory over Judea in 70 of the Common Era. So the facts were there sitting in Rome. The Romans knew that they had defeated Judah. The Romans knew that they had expelled the Judeans. Somehow, some of these historians have managed to miss some of that interesting data. And so what have I learned along the way? Well, first of all, genetic genealogy means guilt by association. If my DNA is the same as your DNA, we might as well get along because we're related. And that is the case. Interestingly, it now appears that all Jewish men on the planet descend from less than 800 unique individuals who have survived from antiquity until today. And so even though there may be 8 million male Jews on the planet, we descend from an amazingly small number of just 800 men. Some more prolific, some less prolific, but those are the lineages that have survived and have come down to us. And to participate in this game, if anyone's interested, all it takes is a swab. And so swab's really easy. It's non-invasive. Well, other than you're putting it inside your mouth. I don't find it nearly as gag reflex bringing on as having to spit into the little cup that some of the other companies offer. but we once had a cartoonist who came to my partner Max and I and said, I don't want to pay for a DNA test, but I'll draw you a cartoon. Tell me the best story you've got. And we said, oh, it's easy. It was the doctor who tested once and got nothing, who tested, we sent him another kit, tested a second time, and he got nothing.
Wow.
And we got him on the phone. And he said, I'm doing just what you said. I'm scraping the outside of my cheek. We said, no, you're supposed to scrape the inside of your cheek. And so you could tell he was embarrassed. He goes, well, let me just understand. You want me to scrape the outside of the inside of my cheek or the inside of the outside of my cheek? And we said, look, we really don't care. You know, where are you scraping? The cartoonist said, stop. I don't need any more. So the next cartoon is a picture of a guy. He's got his family tree DNA test kit. He's got his scraper out. He's on the phone and he's saying, doctor, I'm having a little difficulty with my cheek swab. Now, one of the best slides or one of the best cartoons I've seen on this subject was actually penned the year of the Kohanim study in 1997, before there was any commercial DNA testing, before there were swabs, before there was spit. It's the picture of the woman who says, you don't look anything like the long-haired skinny kid I married 25 years ago. I need a DNA test to make sure it's still you. And then actually my favorite, not because I agree with what this guy's doing, but because it shows how ubiquitous DNA testing has become in our society. It's the picture of a man in Florida holding a piece of cardboard, and the sign says, need money for DNA test, girlfriend might be sister. And so I only have, let's see, there's one more story that I could tell you, and I probably should. It's a couple slides later than when I had intended it. But after the Jews were brought to Rome as slaves in 74 or 75 of the Common Era, they were actually sold to local Italians as slaves. And the story says, or the stories go, that those Jews were slaves for quite a number of years. For those of you that don't know, the Italian Jews and most of the Jews in the diaspora did not support the rebellion against Rome that their cousins in Judea were prosecuting on the Romans. And so, but they still felt loyalty to those Jews when they were enslaved. And so there was this effort to buy the freedom of the Jews who had been enslaved. And it said that the price that that the slave owners actually wanted was not that great, because as it turns out, seemingly the Jews weren't very good slaves. The reason we weren't very good slaves is that we refused to work on Saturday. The Judean slaves would not eat the same food as the rest of the slaves, and apparently they wanted the entire month of October off. And so with that, I thank you for your attention today. I hope you've learned a few things, maybe have questions. What I've decided to do here is I put my email address down there, and you're welcome to email me if you have questions. Also, because I anticipated it would not be a crowd of hundreds today, I put my cell phone down in the event you don't get a chance to ask a question and you want to ask something that's related to DNA testing. I sold the company a year and a half ago, so I'm not going into the office anymore. And as a result, I have a little bit more free time than I used to have. And so I don't find it objectionable if someone has a question on this subject and they want to contact me. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought this was really fascinating. Excuse my voice. A few years ago, I was in Israel and I took a tour in Jaffa. And the tour guide was this very bitter former Israeli soldier who became very pro-Palestinian. And he starts the tour saying, for you people who think that the Jews or Hebrews were here during ancient time, you might as well believe in Greek mythology. Okay? Very ugly. Of course, I questioned him on this, challenged him. The teenagers didn't like it that I challenged him, but obviously this was anti-Semitic, even though he was Jewish.
It was self-hating.
Self-hating, horrible. Yes, in another small anecdote, just the importance of what you're talking about. Bill Clinton, in his memoir, describes how Yasser Arafat said to him exactly the same thing. There were no Hebrews here in ancient times. And Bill Clinton was aghast. So what you're talking about is so relevant to this whole conversation in the Middle East.
Thank you. I just so you know, I've been asked to speak at the APAC policy conference in the past, and the little breakout sessions. And the first year they gave me a room 50, and it just filled up, and so they moved me into a larger room with 100. And the next year they put me into a larger room. And then the third year they said, congratulations, you got an upgrade. And I said, what is an upgrade? And they said, you're going to speak to like club members. And I said, well, I really like to speak to the masses. I don't want to speak to the, elite guys just because they wrote big checks. And they said, well, let's see how many people come, how many people sign up. So about 2 weeks before the last policy conference in 2020, I think I had 45 people in my session. And I was really not happy. I was really disappointed because, they have thousands of people come. And this is a message that if every Jew on the planet knew, it wouldn't be a bad thing. Sure. And so they said, okay, we're going to open it up and we're going to put you in a room that you're not going to be able to fill. So they put me in a room with 450 people and we ended up with 389 people who came to it. And so, yeah, I recognize what you're saying. And look, I don't have a dog in this fight. I mean, this is how the numbers turned out. I just happened to be the guy who was at the right place at the right time to create an industry. And now I'm seeing the industry's data conflicts with, with professors, all of whom seem to be angry and all of whom seem to be bitter as they deliver your message, kind of like the tour guide that you were talking about. And I've never spoken to any of these guys other than Hayak about the data itself. And Hayak simply was not hearing anything that would show that Ashkenazi Jews are related to Sephardic Jews. And he didn't really care, what the facts were. And, one more second. And the reason I know that is because he told me that he had gone to Israel after he had made one of his studies, and he was asked to review a doctor named Harry Oster's book on the autosomal DNA of the Jewish people. And it was going to be him and another professor and the commentator. And he said, in fairness to him, he said, I really shouldn't come to review the book because I haven't read it. And the response was, well, neither have I and neither is the other speaker. So we're on the same playing field. And they had the interview and they trashed him.
Oh, wow.
But they're trashing him without knowing what they're talking about. And when you talk and you don't have any guideposts, you can say all kinds of things.
Yeah. And
that's what these guys are actually doing now.
Well, I'm really perplexed. I'm a former academic. I'm really, I said it, this is perplexing. I'm a former academic and I'm really disturbed, first of all, by what apparently the motivation for writing such books that say there's no roots in Israel, et cetera. It has to be, there's no such thing as Jews, essentially. So I mean, is that just another, it's a nonviolent Holocaust. It's like, let's not have, there are no Jews. Why are you pretending to be a Jew?
Well, and Shlomo Sand's most recent book on Judaism was from 2016. It was called How I Stopped Being a Jew. Now, remember, he's not anything else, but he still considers himself an Israeli citizen and wouldn't move back to France because the coffee scene's not as good as it is as Dizengoff.
So the thing about that is very disturbing. And to imagine that people are giving reviews and speaking without reading a book. I mean, this is part of the dumbing down of America, but it's really frightening because the students are going to hear these things.
It's worse. It's academic dishonesty.
Yes.
The man who said the mythic exile of the Jews from Judea, I'm glad you finally put up the slide. I'm sitting there going, but the Romans carved it in stone.
Thank you.
Because it's been pointed out, that's the only way we have an image of the menorah they carried off as loot, is they were so proud of it, they carved that on the arch, and now it's on the seal of the country of Israel. And we wouldn't have that information if they hadn't been bragging. But they carved in stone. It's not up to question. The worst you could say is that the Romans falsely claimed to have done it. But he didn't say that. He said it was a made-up story. So he's academically dishonest. And that's disturbing, because I naively believe in academic integrity.
Bennett, thanks for this wonderful presentation, and thanks for educating us on these topics, which I think are like really great. Is there an area are there articles that maybe you've worked on, or that you would refer to us to that would allow us to share this kind of knowledge more broadly with our friends? I do think it's really powerful and convincing. And maybe before you answer that, I want kind of one little anecdote. There's an organization called Memory online. They help media watch for the Middle East. And they had a Russian diplomat speaking on, I think it was Lebanese television just a week ago, talking about how the Ukraine war is a ploy by the Jews of Israel to rebuild the Khazar Empire, and that we're funding the Ukraine war. We started the Ukraine war to recapture southern Ukraine to make a second Israel. So it's very much out there, and unfortunately being expanded upon because he doesn't get your research.
Remember, when you don't have, to stay in the guidelines of truth, you can say anything.
Totally.
And that's what we're looking at here. The far left and the far right and the I'll just refer to the parochial Arab community in the Middle East. Okay. They have an agenda. And look, remember, Mahmoud Abbas, his PhD is on the Holocaust, which he denies. Okay, just to kind of, give us some context. Okay, the real truth is that in all likelihood, many, many, many of the Palestinians are of Jewish ancestry and chose to stay on the land and convert, if that's what they had to do, not to be exiled, to join the majority and not be on the side of the Jews who were going to get kicked out so that they could stay on the land. And there are ancient tribes who I'm sure converted, and there are not so ancient tribes. In other words, conversions that took place that the Israelis know about that took place in the 1800s.
Sure.
But these guys are not lining up. They're not coming back. They're not coming back.
But maybe an article or something, has any big publication pick some of this topic up? Has any Jewish journal or?
No, really has. Sometimes when I speak, there's a journalist in the crowd and there's an article that's penned.
But I do think it's I think
It's
I know. And especially as our 75th anniversary of the state of Israel's founding, is coming this year. In January, we'll be celebrating, and the whole spring, we have a lot of Israeli-related programming. Our Israel Advocacy Committee is meeting and discussing. So if you're interested in helping us spearhead more programming related to Israel and Israel advocacy, please let us know, and please get involved with the Adult Education Committee, with Ed Hirsch, with Ed Septimus, or let me know in our Israel Advocacy Committee as well, are planning and programming and working together to educate our congregation and our community about these important issues. So Bennett Greenspan, thank you so much. It was wonderful. Everybody is invited to the Choctaw Library. We have a lovely brunch set up with bagels and lox. Please join us online. Thank you for being part of this. We have recorded the session. We'll send it out to everybody else who have registered as well, or anyone else who would like it. And have a wonderful rest of your day. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I have.